So welcome back, and we are beginning part 2 of the brain. Here we're going to look at the brainstem, which consists of the hindbrain and midbrain, and we're also going to look at the forebrain, consisting of the limbic system and the cortex. Here's a diagram of your brain. The forebrain is the uppermost and largest brain area, and it consists of the corpus callosum and the cerebral cortex. Next, you'll see the midbrain, which is down in the center, and that is involved in processing sight and sound. And then there's the hindbrain, and this connects the brain to the spinal cord. It includes the pons, the cerebellum, the reticular formation, and the medulla. Let's look at each of these more in depth. So the hindbrain structures, let's look at these first, which consist of the cerebellum as well as the parts of the brainstem. So the cerebellum is responsible for coordinated movement, and these are the movements that we know how to do, but we don't have to really focus on doing them, just like riding a bicycle, for example, or when David Beckham kicks a soccer ball. We know that his cerebellum is highly activated. So damage to the cerebellum shows up in uncoordinated movement. And as I mentioned in the previous section, Kim Peek had severe damage to his cerebellum, and that manifested in his uncoordinated walk and his inability to dress himself. Now let's look at the medulla. The medulla automatically regulates vital life functions, such as breathing, heart rate, and reflexes. The fact that your heart is beating and you're automatically breathing while listening to this lecture is the result of your medulla doing all that work for you. Now, the reticular formation is like the gatekeeper for when and what you pay attention to. It also regulates sleep and arousal. So, for example, imagine that you're driving down a long, flat, boring stretch of highway in Kansas, say. Your reticular formation helps keep you awake, even though this drive is slightly boring. Now, suddenly, in the corner of your eye, you glimpse something moving, and you become much more alert. And you're suddenly paying much closer attention because you see that there's a deer running along the side of the road. So here your reticular formation sent you the signal to be more alert, potential danger, as this deer could potentially jump in front of your car. So your reticular formation tells you in this situation, hey, pay attention. The pons is located in the hindbrain, and it is largely responsible for balance as well as relaxation. Now let's look at the forebrain structures. Here we're going to find the thalamus, and we're also going to find the limbic system, which consists of the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And also in the forebrain, we'll find the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is the relay station of your brain. And this part of the brain directs incoming stimuli to the appropriate part of the brain for processing. So when visual information goes in, it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it to the occipital lobe in the back of your brain, for example. So the limbic system, again, that includes the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Let's look at each of these a little bit more in depth. Your hypothalamus helps regulate your bodily functions, such as thirst, hunger, sleep, sex drive, and your body temperature. So, for example, when you drove to school this morning and you noticed maybe that your car was freezing cold, It was your hypothalamus that told you that, and you turned on the heat. The hypothalamus is also related to the hormone cycle in your body. So the hypothalamus releases hormones or releasing factors, which in turn cause the pituitary gland to release its hormones into the bloodstream. Now let's take a look at the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible, amongst other things, for identifying emotions from facial expression. We also know the amygdala for its role in our fight or flight or freeze response. Our amygdala also holds some of the earliest memories of life in the form of emotional content. So, in short, the amygdala is a large storage bank that reaches back to our infancy before we have words to describe things. And with this emotional memory bank, the amygdala helps us to identify facial expressions. So if someone has damage to their amygdala, they were not able to successfully identify all of those faces that I just showed you. Now let's look at the hippocampus. The hippocampus is largely responsible for explicit memories, or those are the memories that you can explain. Some examples of explicit memories are when you got your driver's license, perhaps your 18th birthday, or what you did this past Saturday night. Have you ever wondered why you cannot remember your first birthday? The reason why is because your hippocampus is not fully online yet. Your hippocampus starts to come online more so during your 3rd year of life and is much more activated by your 5th year of life. So for most of us, our earliest memories are from when we're right around 5 years old. The thing to remember about the hippocampus is, yes, we are born with it, but it is not populated with the capacity to remember explicit things yet. Think of it as a computer, and when you buy a new computer, you have purchased some software programs such as Word, Microsoft Word, and you have not populated that program with files yet. And that's what's happening with your hippocampus when you're born. It's there, it's just not fully online yet. Not until you're right around 5 years old. So now let's look at the lobes of the cortex. So you have the frontal lobe, and that's the largest lobe. It produces voluntary muscle movements. It's involved in thinking, attention, emotional control, and planning, such as consequential thinking. Next, you have the temporal lobe, which is on the sides of your head. And this is the primary receiving area for auditory information. You also have the occipital lobe. This is in the back of your head. And this is the primary receiving and processing area for visual information. And then you have the parietal lobe. And this lobe is going to be responsible for processing somatic information. Go ahead and take a look at this graphic of each of those lobes that I just described to you. On this slide, you're going to see the somatosensory cortex, which is behind the primary motor cortex, which is in the front part of your brain, right behind the motor cortex in the frontal lobe. So note that in the somatosensory cortex, the more sensitive body part is, the greater the representation on that somatosensory cortex. So for example, a relatively large part of the somatosensory cortex is dedicated to the tongue. Take a look at that on the left part of the slide, whereas a relatively small part of the somatosensory cortex is dedicated to the elbow. So if you touch your elbow right now, you're going to notice that it's not very sensitive. On the left side of the brain, you'll find two centers of language processing, the Wernicke and the Broca's area. The Wernicke area is responsible for our ability to understand language. The Broca's area is responsible for our ability to speak language. So now let's take a look at hemispheric specialization. The left hemisphere primarily governs our language ability. So remember, that's where we are going to find both the Wernicke and the Broca's areas. The right hemisphere is dominant for emotional expression, especially strong negative emotions such as disgust and repulsion. It also is dominant in processing music, the emotional tone of speech, as well as sense of direction. I have a question for you. When you look at this picture, how do you think this guy feels? Most of us will say he feels sad. The reason is that our right hemisphere, which remember is dominant for reading emotions, gets its sensory input from the left side of our body, in this case the left eye. Thus, we are more likely to interpret this face as sad, because the sensory input, remember, is going into the right hemisphere, which processes emotion from our left eye, and our left eye is focusing on the left side of that guy's face. Now take a look at this. Here, most of us are more likely to say that this guy is happy. And it's for the same reason. Remember, the right hemisphere processes emotional content, and it is receiving its input from the left side of our body, and our left eye is zoning in on the left side of this picture. All right, here's the Mona Lisa. Take a look at her. Most of us say we don't really know how she's feeling. Most of us would describe her as feeling ambivalent. And again, the reason for this is the same reason as we described the feelings in the previous pictures. Because the left side of her mouth, which is sending input to the left eyeball in us, and that's wired to the right hemisphere in our brain. So the left side of her face, her mouth is really kind of flat, sort of ambivalent, versus the right side of her face is more turned up. But again, because our right hemisphere is dominant for processing emotion, we're getting the sensory input from our left eye, and our left eye is signaling a flat, less curved mouth.